The sea ate the light as if it were a living thing, carding black tongues over the pebbled shore and coughing it back in silver breath. The wind held salt and the sting of iron. John stood beneath the raw scaffolding that passed for a hall at Hardhome, watching smoke slither from cook fires and drift toward the water, where the bay sucked and murmured as if it knew the shape of men and waited to make a meal of them. Above, ravens turned like scraps of night, loud and uneasy. He had come to barter for lives, and the place had the feel of old bargains gone rancid. Hardhome was no city, only ribs and driftwood, old whalebone and thaw-warped timbers yanked from the surf and hammered into fences by hands that could think of nothing else to keep the dark out. Thousands of wildlings pressed around those palisades, a camp more than a settlement, huts sharp as broken teeth. Children ran with bare feet and stone knives. Women stitched fur with gut thread. Men sharpened steel and bone that would dull or shatter on ice or dead hands. There was not enough food. There was never enough food. The air carried a taste of snow that had not yet begun to fall. It would, John knew, perhaps before the day was out. The sky had a weight to it. He had learned the moods of sky and sea, learned when cold placed a palm on your back and when it meant to push. Tormund Giantsbane came up the ladder with the sound of a man too big for climbing. His boots thumping rungs, breath fogging thick. "They're waiting for you," he said. "And they don't like waiting. They don't like me," John said. Tormund grinned through his beard. "No, they don't. But they like your ships and your fat man's porridge more than they hate you. That's enough." The wildling chieftains gathered inside the long hall, where whale oil burned in cracked bowls and smoke clung to rafters. They sat in half circles around a low table that had once been the side of a boat. Karsi was there, her hair bound tight against her skull, a mother's hand that knew fighting, eyes that weighed and cut. A then, with a scar like a blanched river down his face, leaned on his axe, silent, his breath louder than his patience. There were elders whose names John did not know, men and women who had seen more winters than he had days of command, and some who had seen fewer and acted older. "You say you'll take us through your wall," said Karsi, voice steady, her gaze holding him as if it were a blade itself. "You say we can live. You put wilding babes in the shadow of that ice. You say, we've heard kings say before." "I'm no king," John told her. "I took a vow to guard the realms of men. All the realms, all the men, all the women, all the children." He felt the words like an iron brand, not hot but heavy. "You know what's coming. You've all seen it now. The dead don't care if you're from a crofter's village or a wildling camp. They do not tire. They do not bargain. They only add to their number. You ask us to kneel to kneelers," the then said, and his mouth hated the shape of it. "I ask you to live," John said. His voice surprised him, too soft, as if he were speaking to Arya, to Bran, to Ghost. He cleared his throat. "We have ships at Eastwatch. We can take you south. We can open the gates." Karsi's mouth twitched at that last. "Your brothers will open their gate to our people? I will open it." He let them see his face then, the flatness of the cost spelled there. "Those who follow me will share the bread and salt. The rest can stare and do as they like. But I'll open it." Tormund laughed, a low rumble. "He means it. Never knew a crow mean anything so stubbornly." "They'll call you Crow King," Karsi said lightly, but there was no heat in it. She looked away, toward the door where bay wind tried to shoulder through the gaps. "You have ships. A few. We have thousands. Thousands won't fit. We go in turns," John said. "The old first, the young, mothers and babes. We'll leave men to guard the rest until the ships return. Every day we wait feeds the dead." "The dead feed themselves," said the then, but no one laughed. "Dragon glass?" Karsi asked, sudden as a thrown rock. "You have more of that?" "Enough to make a difference," John said. In truth, there was less than he wished, still too much in sacks and not enough in hands. Ghost had led him to a cache at the Fist of the First Men, and he had sent what they had to Eastwatch to be worked, tips for spears and arrowheads, a few knives brittle as a prayer. It was not enough. It would never be enough. There had been talk of dragonstone, of volcanoes and walls covered in black glass, but talk did not kill the dead. Karsi looked at Tormund. Something moved between them that Jon did not see, old as kin and cut with loss. She raised her chin. "We'll begin," she said. "My people first, then the thens. The elders, the children, the women. If your ships come back 2 days in a row, I'll put men to guard the rest. If they don't, I'll kill you myself. Fair." "Fair?" Jon said, and the word struck him as foreign, thin as summer cloth. They came out into a sky that had darkened from pewter to slate. The gulls had gone off somewhere, and the ravens flew lower, their calls quick and nervous. A wind had found its courage, coming off the water, snatching warmth from faces, fingers, the backs of knees. Men moved faster without meaning to. The line of folk that had formed at the crude gate became a press, then a crush, then something near panic. Tormund bellowed until his throat went ragged. Ed stood on a crate and made a sword of his arm to cut a path, and still the mass of bodies swayed and shoved. Jon put his hand on a boy's head, the hair wiry, a watchful mother's breath hot on his wrist. He'd seen men trample men in the yard at Winterfell to reach a skin of wine. This would be worse if it broke. He never knew what sound snapped the last bit of quiet across Hardhome. It wasn't a horn. There had been horns, the rough call of a hollowed bone blown in warning when raiders approached. This was closer, stranger. A sigh turned inside out. It traveled along the inside of bones. You felt it, and then you heard it as if your blood had learned a new trick. Every face found it. Every hand paused. The long dark of the trees that crept down the hills above Hardhome seemed to exhale. The line of the forest wavered, then unrolled like a banner, and out of that black and gray came shapes that were not shadows. They moved as water moves when it has frozen while thinking of movement, the jerky smooth of a broken puppet. Men ought to shout then, and some did, but most only stared. The dead did not hurry. They had nowhere to be. They did not need to win this hour. They had all the hours. Karsi said a word in some inland language, and Jon did not need translation. The first of the whites hit the fence like a wave, and where they struck, the fence shattered, Oldwood parting with a scream that sounded almost alive. Arrows went up and fell, and some lodged in meat and stayed there, but the meat kept walking. The smell came next, wrong and old, like fish left under straw with the sun on it, like old birth, like caves no one had opened in a long time. Then the sound, the dead made almost none by themselves, but the things about them made plenty. The smack of bone, the pull of wet cloth, the glee of crows, the terrified breath of the living. Jon drew Longclaw. He had never liked the way the Valyrian steel drank light. Today he was glad of its hunger. "Dragon glass to the spears," he shouted. "Ed, left with me. Tormund, boats." "Boats?" Tormund growled, and already he was hurling men toward the shore with his hands, 2 at a time. They held the first rush by the palisade with spearwork clumsy but brave. A spear tipped in dragonglass punched through a man who had once been a man. He went down with no scream, only a noise like sand pouring into a bag. Whites clawed at faces and throats and dragged at legs. The wildlings fought like people who understood that the only way out was through. If this had been a raid, if this had been a squabble of free folk or a fight among brothers, Jon would have admired it. Of course it wasn't that. This was a tide. No blade could cut a tide. No arm could shove it back. They fell. They all fell, men and women, the young, the old. Jon kept them from falling all at once. The White Walkers came with the next breath of wind. Jon felt them before he saw them. The air made brittle, the edges of the world too sharp. Frost feathered across spears and the hoops of barrels. The moisture in men's hair turned to crystals that caught the last honest light and made a mockery of stars. The walkers moved more slowly than the dead, with a kind of cold joy. Their armor took on the sullen glow of sky ice. One carried a spear of frozen water that shed little shards as it turned, tinkling. When that spear touched a young then's bronze, the bronze split with a noise like an acorn cracking, and the boy looked surprised as his chest opened like wet paper. Jon met one where the fence had broken. Longclaw rang when it touched the walker's blade, a high winterbell note that made his teeth ache. The cold came up his arms into his chest. into the old scar on his heart that never quite stopped hurting. He cut and parried and cut again, feeling nothing the way a man feels nothing in numb hands, watching his movements through a window. The walker smiled. It was like a fissure opening in a frozen lake. He swung low and the walker leapt, impossibly light, and came down with both hands on its blade as if he were cutting a tree. John turned his own cut into a block and felt something give. Not in his arms, in the world. The walker's blade shattered. Longclaw sang down through the thing's shoulder and into its heart, if it had a heart. It broke like a statue kicked downstairs. Around them, 100 wights fell as if a net had been lifted from their mindless bodies. They did not lack for more. Smoke rolled in, blackening the air where fires had started in huts and caught old thatch. The bay cracked itself against the shore. Boats that had seemed many suddenly seemed few, crowded with mothers who did not look at each other, clutching children as if arms could make a wall better than wood. Tormund was everywhere at once. Ed had blood down his cheek that had turned black at the edges, and he kept blinking as if one eye would not see. "Get them moving," John shouted. "We hold until dark." He did not believe it. He said it anyway. Something answered him that was not a horn, not a scream, not the sound of wood yielding. It came from the sky, a voice too large for the word voice. It did not seem to come from any one point. It arrived. The air beneath it trembled. The ground did too. For a moment John thought some great piece of the cliff had broken free, a landslide falling through cloud. Shadows swung across the camp, swifter than raven wings, and in the spaces between light and what obscured it were shapes that did not belong to this place. Men looked up. Wildlings cried out the old names. Naga, Naga, spirits in bone and wind. Some falling to knees, others reaching for children as if to tug them down and hide them under the scrape of the world. The dragon came down on the far side of the fence, as if the sky had thrown a blade. The blast of its wings knocked snow from the cliff face in sheets. It opened its mouth and fire came as if someone had split the day and inside had been a furnace. The dead burned. They burned as meat burns, shrinking to themselves, and something in the fire drove the cold back as a beaten dog is driven. For a breath, for two, heat struck John like a hand. He found himself laughing, mad and simple, because the dead burned and did not rise in the flame. It was not alone. Another shape circled above, green-black in the failing light, its hide catching colors as oil catches them on water, luminous and wrong. The first dragon's roar shook the inside of John's head. It wore a woman. She was light on the beast's back, a blade of a woman with hair like pale flame, clothes furred against the cold and stitched like a prince's, with a face John had seen only in rumor. Her dragon's wings flung men hard to the ground with each hammering downbeat. She pulled the beast up short above the beach, and it hung there, beating at the air as if the sky were something you could pound into arrangement. Fire washed in a wide arc across the sand, a wall that ate the wights as fast as they came. The second dragon stooped low enough to skim snow with its claws. It bellowed once, a lower sound that made John think of stones grinding in a deep place. It had no rider. Tormund came to John's side, laughing and swearing and making signs he'd once made to fight off spirits. "You sent for this?" he shouted over the wind and the roar. "I sent for ships and help," John shouted back. "I didn't expect." "You didn't expect a woman on a flying lizard," Tormund finished merrily. "Nobody expects a woman on a flying lizard. Move, move, you goat fondlers. Get in the bloody boats." The woman guided her dragon with her hands and her body, the way a horseman moves, only fiercer, wholly committed. She cut a swath along the palisade, turning wights into ash. John moved in the space she made and killed what the fire missed. The walker at the gap had gone. Another took its place, shy of the flames, spear gleaming like the bones of a river. It tested the heat with an outstretched blade and drew back not in fear, but with the patience of ice. The riderless dragon came down on the packed earth hard enough to force men to spread wide, to throw themselves flat or be crushed. Its foreclaws dug gullies in frozen dirt. Its eyes were not like a beast's. They were not like a man's. John saw their gold, and in their gold something old, and within that something that recognized him. It turned its head, that long serpent grace, and brought its face up to him as if to taste what he was. It breathed out. The air it made smelled of burned meat and hot stone and some bitter thing that bit wind and throat alike. John did not move. His body wanted to run and wanted to kneel and wanted to touch its hide, to test whether it was warm or hot or some new thing. He did not move because the dragon needed him not to. It had the stillness of a dangerous horse, the kind that would put you on your back if you lied to it with your feet and hands. He lifted his free hand, the one without steel, slowly, palm out. The dragon's nostrils flared and touched his skin. The heat of it seemed to sink into his palm, into the old white scars there, into bone. He could not tell if the sound he heard then came from its throat or his own mind. A low, curious note, almost content. The other dragon's rider was watching him. She had turned her beast to hover, the air around her a storm. The wind tore at the pale hair that had taken flame from the sky, and her eyes were as far as the stars and as close as the knife at his belt. She had the face of a queen in a story, the kind about which old women lower their voices and put in too many details when the children ask again. She guided the dragon lower, and it landed in a scattering of embers and ash and screaming wood. So near John could have reached up and touched its scales if reaching up had not been such a terrible idea. "Jon Snow?" she called, her voice carrying as if the air wanted to deliver it. "Yes," he said. "I am Daenerys Targaryen," she said, as if that were an answer to more questions than he had asked. "I was told there was a thing north of the world that no story had the courage to tell. I see it. I am here with fire." He looked past her to the whites, to the walkers testing the edges of flame. The Night King was not yet on the field. He was not yet needed. Jon looked back at the riderless dragon, at the way it had not yet taken its eyes from him, and at the edges of his vision something shook itself free and flew up, blue petals in a place of ice, a scent of winter roses. He did not know why his heart beat so hard. He did not name it. "That one?" Daenerys lifted one hand to the circling beast. "Regal. He has no saddle. Do I need one?" Jon asked before his sense caught up to his mouth. "If you want to stay on," she said, and then her eyes narrowed very slightly, like a woman who had made a decision and did not mean to explain it twice. "He knows you. I don't know why. We have no time to doubt it. You can clear the breach. Take him and burn them back. Keep the dead from the boats. I will guard the water." Tormund barked laughter that had a bit of fear in it, and a bit of pride. "Go on, King Crow," he said. "You always wanted to fly." Jon ought to have said that he had not, that men fell from heights, that the ground had a long memory for fools. Instead he moved toward the dragon because the world had narrowed to a thought. The boats, the children, the smell of old dead things getting closer. He took the ridge of scales like a line of stones. They were rough and hot. He felt heat through his glove and pulled it off, took the next with bare hand, and when the beast shifted, he moved with it, putting his body where balance told him to be, not where he wished. There was no saddle. There was a ridge where he could wedge his knees and a space for his hips that had not been made for him and fit him anyway. "Hold with your legs," Daenerys called, and there was a slant of smile in it. "Not your hands. If you fall, fall where there is water. It might pity you." Regal, Jon found the name in his mouth like a coin, threw himself into the air. The world dropped out. Men became ants, then smaller. The palisade unstitched and the burn line along the snow became a seam soldered by a god. The bay opened hard and bright, black as polished iron. Jon's breath fled his body and came back only because the dragon's body commanded air to be there. He leaned where the beast leaned and found, with astonishment flat and total, that the thing beneath him wanted what he wanted. It wanted to rise and to kill and to wheel into the wind and to drink it. They came down over the gap in the fence like a scythe. Regal drew air into his lungs and poured it out as fire, and the fire made a wild sound that had nothing to do with wind. Jon saw whites blacken, curl, fall. He saw a walker step back from the edge of flame and raise a hand against it as if to hold it at bay by will alone. He did not look at the walker's face. He looked where the fire must go next and nodded with his whole body, and the dragon read it. Turned a little thought with him. John laughed again, some ragged thing, and fire went where he looked. He saw Karsi then, mouth set, hair wild, pushing two little girls toward a boat. She turned to watch a line of children, small and fast, sprinting toward the beach. They were quick enough to outrun slow dead, not quick enough to outrun dead children. The things that came for them were soft and wrong, with blue mouths and little hands. Karsi stopped. She had an axe in hand. She did not raise it. John watched her eyes fill with something like recognition and then with nothing at all. She let the axe fall. The little dead reached her, and he could not help her, and that was all. He brought fire across the sand where other children ran, and that made some things right for a heartbeat, but rightness had little strength here. He turned Regal back toward the gap. He saw a walker standing alone among snow and ashes like a statue on a cliff. He leaned with the dragon, and they went lower, until both could feel the thermal of the fire bounce off the ground and meet the air falling down from wings. The walker's spear came up. John knew what it would do to him. He stood up on the dragon's spine, without telling his body to do it, and brought Longclaw down in the same motion. The steel sang. So did he. The walker's spear lifted to meet it and broke like water meeting stone. Longclaw cut through the walker's head as if it were glass, and the creature shattered, and 20 wights dropped in a ring around the place it had stood, the flame reflecting in their empty eyes as it went out. He and the dragon wheeled to the left without thinking it through, and so the spear that passed under them was a hand's breadth beneath his boot instead of through his chest. It hurled past and struck a piece of timbers, the spear's kiss turning the wood to 1,000,000 diamond shards. The man who had thrown it stood on the cliff above Hardhome in a place that had seemed too far to matter a moment ago. He did not look as if he had made an effort. He did not look as if he had enjoyed it. He wore the world like a skin grown too tight. The Night King lowered his hand. Regal screamed. It was not the song of fire now, but a challenge. A sound that said there were old stories and the dragon wanted them to be true. He beat his wings and went up into the air faster than John's stomach wanted. John had a moment to think. If that spear had been a finger higher, he would be falling in pieces now. He had a moment to feel odd gratitude toward the woman who told him to hold with his legs. His fingers had lost themselves somewhere. Daenerys came across the top of Hardhome like a storm carried on a bigger storm. Drogon. He did not know the beast's name, but it was written in the way it moved, through fire almost lazily, and the fire carved arcs between one world and the next. She looked up at John as they crossed each other's paths, a glance quick and bright and entirely clear of doubt. She turned her dragon toward the cliff. They tried. John could say that much later and have it be true. He and Daenerys and the dragons tried to put enough fire between the living and the dead that the living could finish getting into boats. They bit at the tide and bit again. The walkers learned the pattern of it, learned what the dragons would not dare, learned to skirt and wait and throw ice into the right place at the right instant. The Night King stood and watched. He held his second spear long in his hand and weighed it as a man weighs a word he means to say. John told Regal no. It surprised him, the simplicity of the thought. No, they would not stoop to the cliff. Not today. He saw the shape of his own death in the way the Night King had stood, in the leisure of his hands, and knew that the creature could miss today and not mind at all, knowing he would have more chances. John did not mean to give him another. Regal turned back toward the beach. Men ran with bundles that contained their lives, blankets, knives, brittle gods, and mostly they dropped those bundles because it is hard to carry much when strangers pick up your children and thrust them at you and tell you to run. The boats pushed out. They had not been made for this fast. Their ribs creaked. A woman cried out and reached for a hand in a boat. Another woman got out to give her place and would not take it back. Tormund waded out until water took his waist and bellowed at men who did not know how to row. Ed stood in a boat with his sword up and pointed at a place he wanted to be. It helped more than anything else. John brought fire down in a wide arc that did not touch the water. It cost him something not to panic and scorch the sea. He did not know if dead water would be worse than water and did not want to find out. Regal's breath ran out and drew in and ran out again. His chest beneath John rose like a bellows that could swallow a house. John felt his thighs burn where they gripped the dragon's spine. His hands had little work and much fear. They could have left then. Enough people had taken boats that they might have declared victory inside their own skulls and gone back to where the wall was a line you could put faith in. There were men who did just that with their eyes. John did not. He looked at the far side of the camp where a last knot of wildlings had not moved because some were wounded, some were old, and one giant stood up to his waist in a knot of dead and pulled them off him like a man shakes burrs free of his leggings. 1-1. John felt his heart reach for the giant as for a boyhood friend. 1-1 brought up a piece of a mast and swept 3 ranks of whites away into air. He roared, and the sound made the bay answer itself. Daenerys saw them too. She and Drogon went like the tip of a spear, and Jon and Rhaegal made the shaft. Their fire tore open a corridor between the giant and the beach. 1-1 thumped toward water. A walker stepped into his path. Its spear went into 1-1's thigh as easily as a man sticks a skewer into roast pork. The giant made a sound Jon had never heard a creature make. Half pain and half fury and half something else large enough that it got another half for itself. He brought the mast down. It struck the walker and went through it, and the walker burst into frost and sparks. Half the dead in that part of the camp collapsed like puppets with the strings cut and then jerked back up as other hands found their strings again. On the cliff, the Night King raised his arm. Jon could not have said what told him. Perhaps it was the way the wind died for a blink. Perhaps it was the way the Night King's shoulder tilted, weighted with memory of spearwork across centuries. Perhaps it was the shape of the world just then, a kind of hush that left only the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. He pulled Rhaegal left without knowing that meant anything good. The spear took a path that would have ended in the dragon's eye and instead passed so near Jon that he felt it on his cheek as Winter's own hand. It struck a rock, and the rock became a sort of glitter. There were diamonds in the air for 1 false second. On the beach, whites threw themselves into the water and drowned and stood up again and came on. Daenerys saw that and sent Drogon's fire in a long, unbroken sheet that turned the first yards of sea into a screaming thing. It worked because fire often works, and did not because the dead do not think of fire as a thing to fear if there is another path. They went wider, to places where fire had not yet taught the sea to hate. "Go," Jon heard himself say to the dragon under him, and he heard himself as if he were standing a few feet away. "Go." Rhaegal beat the wind into shape, and they arrowed down to the beach, lower than he had any business being. Jon swung his leg free and dropped from the dragon's back onto a pile of char, half wood and half man. His boots sank. He stumbled once and then ran with Longclaw out ahead of him. Ed saw him and swore, and Tormund saw him and grinned as if Jon had brought him a beer at a feast. A walker moved to meet him, and this one was faster than the others had been, or perhaps Jon was slower, or perhaps he was simply tired of being alive. It cut at him at an angle he did not expect, and only that Valyrian edge and a twist of his wrist in the last breath kept his hand attached to his arm. He felt his shoulder give. He was inside the cold then, inside the world where summer is a lie, and he had to force his feet to move with his hips and not with the world. He gave the walker 2 blows for its one, and the first the thing took, and the second it turned with ice. The third broke its blade, and the fourth broke it. He did not have time to count how many whites fell when that walker went. He would have liked to count. Counting is a way to make sense of the world, a child's trick, and it works. He wanted to count each life that would now row, would now hold a child and tell that child something that was not a lie, but he could not. The dead did not let him. 1-1 made it into the water. He waded as far as he dared, and men made a space for him in the boat he did not fit, which was to say they did not make a space at all and instead shouted and shoved until it occurred to all of them together that if the giant wanted to drown, he would, and if he wanted to live, he would find his way. 1-1 found a way. He grabbed the prow of a boat and put his shoulder to it and pushed, and men rowed and felt like gods. "Back!" it shouted at Jon. Tormund grabbed his arm and pulled. Jon wanted to fight him for a moment, the kind of stupid anger that comes to brave men at the end of a longer brave thing. Then he saw that the Night King had gone still on the cliff again, and that stillness meant something. It meant an end, and it meant a beginning. They ran for the last boat. the one into which someone had crammed an old woman who had stopped seeing, and a man who had not stopped bleeding, and a girl with hair in two plaits that had never both been the same length. John pushed Tormund bodily, and Tormund stepped backward into the boat and hauled John in, and the two of them went down in a barbaric tangle. The boat rocked and would have thrown them if Ed had not put his sword into the gravel and used it as a stake to shove them off. Men grabbed oars and found each other's rhythm by swearing at it. They were 20 yards from shore when the Night King raised both arms. He did it lazily, the way a man stretches after sitting too long, joints complaining. He looked at John as he did it, as if to hold him responsible for the trick he was about to perform. The beach was full of bodies that had been full of lives. John did not know if they had names. He thought he would learn some and never be able to forget them. The bodies rose. It was not a drama. The dead did not tear themselves open to do it. They did not scream. They stood up. That was all. They stood, and the space between being a person and being a thing went away. The girl with the plates reached toward shore as if the tide would bring a doll to the boat. The old woman began to keen. Ed made a sound as if he had been stuck, and Tormund's mouth filled with words he did not choose and would not remember. John met the Night King's eyes. They were blue in a way that had nothing to do with the sky, a cold so pure it had grown a color to spite the world. John felt something answer in him that had nothing to do with dragons or walls or vows. It was older. It was a knowing that hated being known. He put his hand on Regal's hide to steady himself and found it hot and alive and ready to be pointed at a thing that needed killing. There was no way to kill what stood on that cliff. Not now. Not with this. Daenerys brought Drogon between the beach and the cliff like a curtain drawn on a string, laying fire to the new dead in a wide swath. It worked the way buckets work on a fire in a dry house, enough to make the next breath possible, not enough to end it. She turned him again and again until the water between Hardhome and their boat was a field of ghosts made from steam. They made Eastwatch before full dark, rowing until the skin of their hands went ragged and the sea put salt in the wounds. The wall rose from the edge of the world as if it had been made that day by a god more fond of spectacle than sense. Torches ran along the top of it like a string of ornaments on a child's toy. Regal flew so near it in the last quarter of the flight that men on the top threw themselves flat, and a brave one reached out and touched scale with his glove and discovered a story to bargain with later. The gates yawned like a mouth in a pale face. Men and women stumbled inside the castle and collapsed in shapes that would later become beds and pallets and marriages and fights. The cook fires screamed oil to life. 100 tongues spoke at once and told each other what they had seen. Half of those tongues told lies already, because the truth was too straight and they wanted curves. Ghost found John in the yard before he could find water. He came low and fast and white and made a noise a dire wolf ought not to make in a crowded place. Men stepped aside because something in people knows how to get out of the way of a thing that will not stop. Ghost bumped John's hip with his head, hard enough to bruise, and John put his hands into that thick fur and felt the animal's heart and let his own find it. "You saw it?" said a voice behind him, and John turned to find Sam with his cheeks red and his eyes on the edge of wet. "Gods, John, you saw it with your own eyes." "I saw it," John said. His voice sounded like someone else's. "And dragons," Sam said in a tone that made you think of a scholar listing a new entry. "You saw dragons, and one of them saw you, and you rode it. You rode a dragon, John." "I held on," John said, "because humility sometimes comes as a shield, because admitting a wonder can break a man. And it let me." Sam looked past him. John followed his gaze, and there she was, descending from Drogon's back in a glide that was not quite human, nor beast, nor anything he had a word for. She did not seem tired. She seemed raw, peeled open by cold and fire at once, her face a thing both carved and living. She took in the courtyard with eyes that counted and measured and wept in their own way without water. "Lady," said Davos Seaworth, appearing as if a prayer had conjured him, bowl of salt in his voice, ragged cloak held like a lord's by an old habit of respect. He bowed as a smuggler bows to a storm that has not killed him yet. "Welcome to Eastwatch by the Sea." Daenerys Targaryen looked at the wall, at the men, at the wildlings huddled in their new shame of being fed by enemies. She nodded, a small motion that took an empire to perform. "Your wall is beautiful," she said, "and insufficient." She spoke to John then with no ceremony between them because the ceremony was in the air, in the steam rising from the dragon's mouth in the cold. "You know now," she said. "I knew before," he said, "and it was not a boast. It was a grief. Now I've seen what you've seen." "What does that buy us?" she asked softly. "Time," he said. "Men who will believe. The wall will hold a while. Your dragons make it hold longer. We need more than time." "Dragon glass," said Sam behind him, too eagerly, then flushed. "Forgive me. Ser Davos, you told me stories. Dragonstone, that island, Dragonstone is a mountain of it," Davos said, nodding. "I've tripped over the bloody stuff in the dark. You want black glass, that's where the gods spilled it. Then we go to Dragonstone," Daenerys said, as if it were a line of a plan she had already written in her mind, then added with a little smile that did not reach her eyes. "After I have not felt the cold on my bones for an hour." Jon's mouth curved without meaning to. He rubbed a thumb across the ridge of his palm where the dragon's heat had set a memory. The flesh there remembered. "You came because you believed a letter," he said. "Or because someone you trust convinced you to see. Either is more than I had a right to ask." "I came because my hand wrote that I should," she said. "And because the wind would not let me sleep while it moved north. And because men I've never met put their children in the way of a thing that hates children. The wind is good counsel." She rolled her shoulders as if to put her body back into itself. "Your beast likes you." "He's not my—" Jon began and then did not finish the lie. He looked at Regal, who had gone to drape himself along the outer yard like a piece of warm wall. The dragon's eyes were half closed, their gold clouded with drowse. His chest rose and fell. He smoked a little. He smelled, absurdly, of peat. "He is named for my brother," Daenerys said, and something in the way she said brother was not the way a woman in Westeros says it. It was the way a woman names a fall and hears it forever afterward. "Rhaegar, he died before I could know him. There is a kind of joke in the world that the dragon named for him has found you. I don't know if I like the joke." "I don't like jokes the gods make," Jon said. "Then make them back," she said simply. "Make enough that men think they are yours. Men follow the story that tells itself in loudest voice." The rest of the night became a sieve that let little through. Jon slept not at all and did not notice until he noticed and then laughed about it because his body seemed to think he had not asked it for sleep, and perhaps he hadn't. He walked the yard twice and the wall twice and went to the infirmary where men lay telling each other the wrong parts of the truth. He stood with Regal and put his palm against the dragon's shoulder where the muscle bunched under scale and felt that warmth again and hated that he loved it. He went to the yard where Ghost lay with his head on his paws and notched his ear with a lick until Jon sat beside him like a younger brother needing a story. He met Alliser Thorne in a corridor and saw the look in the older man's eyes, the one that said, "You have broken your oath by keeping it." Men were like that. Jon nodded and went past and did not pause to fight a thing he could not win that hour. There would be more hours. The dawn was more iron than gold. The sea had crusted in thin places as if it meant to take up the habit of land. The wind had lost some of its bite, the way a wound loses some of its bite when it begins to scar. Daenerys stood on the battlement, bareheaded, her hair a snare for light that was not there. Her dragon kept to the yard. Her other dragon kept the sky company, sulking in it like a cloud that knows too much. "We will go south," she said without turning, "to Dragonstone. We will raise this glass that is not glass. We will bring it north and hand it to the men who will not like that we put weapons in wildling hands, and we will do it anyway." "We," Jon said, testing it. He found he liked how it felt in his mouth. "You," she said then, and some part of him sagged and stood at once. "I must return to a place that believes a queen must sit still to be won. I will leave you this," she glanced down toward the yard where Regal breathed like a mountain, "and take the other. I cannot tell you why that is the right choice. It is. It will remake the tales either way." "You trust me," Jon said, and this made him as afraid as the Night King's eyes had. "I trust the beast," she said, and now she turned and her mouth had the smallest curve. "And I trust that men who have their hands full of children do not have as many left for treachery. Besides, the dragon has already decided. I would speak sense to it and get less in return than you have." He looked into her face and found that she had salt lines on her cheeks where sea and cold had left ghosts. He wanted to ask her if she had loved someone as he had loved and lost someone as he had lost, and if the world put blue petals in her sleep sometimes. He did not. He said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said without heat. "Make it matter." She stepped nearer and the cold seemed to move back a finger. "And when you tell your men why the dead burned and did not stay down, tell them their steel can be different. Tell them that there are old beds of fire under the world, and sometimes we get to sleep in them instead of on ice. Tell them to listen to the hand that beats at the end of their arm and to put it on this black glass and not be afraid." "I will," he said. His hand had already remembered. "Tyrion will send you letters to teach your soldiers how to send letters," she said, and he found himself smiling without choosing it. "Davos will translate the parts with too many words. You will get your glass, Jon Snow. We will bring it to you. Hold the wall. Hold their hearts." "It will be hard," he said. "It is only hard," she agreed. "It is not impossible." He watched her after that until the heir to okay her and her dragon up and made their shape into something that belonged to the sky more than to men. She did not look back. He did not think less of her for it. There are times when looking back makes the ground jealous and it will claim what you loved. Regal put his head over the walkway and blew warmth onto the side of Jon's face until his ear felt hot. He thought he would never get used to that. He did not want to get used to that. Getting used to miracles makes a man sloppy around them. That day and the next he put men to work on points of dragonglass until their fingers bled. He watched the wildlings learn to fit iron to wood and black glass to iron. He set boys to carry water and women to keep the stoves fed and old men to tell the kind of stories that make young men less pretty about dying. He sent scouts into the haunted forest in a line as gentle as a harp's. Not to seek fights the wall could not win, but to bring back the simple gift of knowing where the dead walk today. He sent ravens until the rookery became a place of sorrow and rage. He told himself that if they flew until their hearts stopped, it was for a reason. On the fourth day, the wind turned and brought with it a smell that was not the sea. It was older than fish and newer than stone. The dead had come near. They paced the edge of the world like wolves who have learned a fence will shock them and are deciding whether hunger is worse. Regal lifted his head and hissed and did not fly. He had learned that the wall was not a thing to fly beyond without a thought. Not now. He would not cross over until Jon's body told him to. Jon had not told him to yet. He would. He could feel the want in the dragon as a want in himself. At dusk, after a day of men discovering that their muscles could hurt more than the day before, Jon stood on the ice where the wind learns to sing like a knife. He thought of the girl with the plates and of Carsey and of the look in the eyes of the thing on the cliff, and he said aloud to no one, "I will not give you our dead. I will not give you our dead," as if they were coin. Snow began at last. It came down straight and quiet. A way snow has of offering the world a secret if you stand still enough to hear it. Regal's breath made a rhythm behind him, not quite a lullaby. Ghost leaned against his leg, all warmth and memory. Somewhere, far to the south, a woman who did not look back directed a fleet to an island whose bones were fire. The Night King stood somewhere to the north, still as a struck heart, and turned the world inside out with patience. He was making his second spear in his mind, or his third, or his thousandth. The dead waited without waiting. The living went on making food and lies and blades and promises. Jon set his hand to the dragon and felt heat travel up his arm and into the softest parts of him. He looked into the falling snow until it became a place he could walk and did not yet step into it. He was a man with a wall and a beast and a promise and 1,000 souls who would not live through winter without him and perhaps not with him. Ygritte's laugh lived somewhere in his chest and always would. The blue petals opened once more in that wrong place and sent their scent into the cold, and he let them, and he did not let them keep him. When the horn blew at last from the top of the wall, It was one long note that meant friends or not enemies or something less than death. The cry of the man on the horn broke halfway through, and John could tell that the cold had found his lungs. He went up, and the dragon rose with him as if the ladder had been made for 4 legs. They came to the top and the world opened, full of teeth and light and emptiness. In the distance, moving like frost across a window, a line of figures approached that were men. Behind them, too far to count, stretched a darkness that was not a storm and not the woods and not a mercy. It moved and did not move. John drew a breath and let it out and did not allow his voice to turn to iron or glass. "Open the gate," he said, and when his men hesitated, he added, "We keep our word or we are not men at all." They opened the gate. The first of the free folk to reach it were boys carrying a woman who no longer made a shape a woman should make. They looked up at the dragon and their faces changed in ways that would be stories later, and then they looked at John and their faces changed again and became hands, as gratitude often does. The men who followed had limbs bound in strips of their own shirts and eyes rimmed in red, and the wary look of deer who have decided the fire is not as bad as the wolf. They passed under the wall. They passed into the sound of men shouting instructions and women shouting names and old men shouting reasons. They passed into a world that could fail them but had chosen not to yet. John watched them all go by. He watched and counted without meaning to. He counted softly, a child's trick. Somewhere in the counting there would be a day when the numbers stopped meaning anything. Today the numbers meant everything. He did not know if it was hope that made them so or some pettiness in him that liked to make order of a thing that would not be ordered. He counted anyway. Regal turned his head and put it over the walkway again until his warm breath pushed the snow into odd patterns. The dragon's eye was a coin given willingly, and John could buy a moment with it. He laid his hand against that warmth and felt something pass between the beast and the man that was not a word. He had been a boy at Winterfell who liked the quiet and feared the empty room. He had been a man at the wall who feared the noise and loved the vow. He was now both and a third thing that had fallen through the sky and not broken. Behind everything, far out where the land forgot to be land and the sky had grown tired of being sky, the Night King walked on the frozen bones of a sea and did not sink. He carried no torch. He needed none. He had all the time in the world and no clock to scold him with it. Men told each other that fire would be enough or that steel would be enough or that walls would keep their old promises if asked nicely. He told himself nothing and went on, because that is what the dead have that the living do not. A certainty that cannot be argued with, cannot be sung at in the night, cannot be kissed softer. John knew this and kept the gate open. He knew this and trained hands to hold black glass instead of iron. He knew this and slept when his body fell like a sack on a pallet and woke when Ghost decided he had left his mind unattended for too long. He knew this and went to the parapet in the hours when the world pretends it has no edges and looked north until north looked back. On the 7th day after Hardhome, when the last of the second boats came in from the place the dead had polished to something like memory, a raven found the yard with a yellow ribbon tied to its leg. Its eyes were meaner than most ravens' eyes. Its beak had a chip out of it as if it had tried to eat a jewel and had been punished. Davos took the ribbon in 2 fingers as if he knew not to touch the message like a man touches a thing that will stain him. He handed the strip of parchment to John with a face that did not know how to pretend. "It's from Dragonstone," he said. "The Queen's hand." John opened it. The words were sharp and small, like the man who had put them there had cut each one from a larger, useless word and left the scraps on the floor. There were numbers that meant ships and weight and men and something called capacity. There were lines about furnaces and tools and how to keep a blade from shattering when you set glass where iron wants to be. There was a note at the end as if the man had needed to be less clever for one moment and had allowed himself a kindness. "Tell the boy with the wolf that dragons like to be scratched where the wing meets the shoulder. It is not a weakness to oblige them." John read it twice and then gave it to Sam, who made a noise he made when he met a book he had wanted and had not dared to want. John walked away into the yard and went to the place where Regal had decided the ground was softer than the other places and leaned against scale and heat and breathed. He did not know, could not know, whether this turning the story made would save any of them. He knew only that he had flown on a dragon and set fire to the dead and watched them stand up in contempt of everything he understood and had still, somehow, gotten children into boats. He knew the smell of the Night King's nearness now the way a man knows the smell of rain. He knew the taste of dragonglass dust on his tongue and that he would be tasting it still when he was old, if he was allowed to be old. He knew, most of all, that when the dead came again, when the horn cried across the ice and the wind moved in a way that meant the world was about to remember its worst self, he would put his legs around a dragon who had chosen to let him and go up into the great nowhere and come down breathing fire. He would do that as many times as there were breaths to take. He would do it, and the men at the wall would put black glass in dead things and watch them become simply things again. He would do it, and the woman with the pale hair would bend a piece of the world to put black stone in his hands until his hands were tired of holding it and his heart was tired of being a heart and there was nothing left. And if it were not enough, if after all of it the blue eyes looked at him from the middle of the world and did not blink, if the Night King came across the frozen sea with the patience of mountains and the certainty of tides, John would still do it again. There are some truths a man accepts because there is no other work to do with them. He put his hand against the dragon's side and felt the answer to a question he had not asked. Not words, not vows, not old banners raised in old halls, but a pulse, steady and sovereign. He held to it like a rope in a high wind. He looked north. Snow slid off the wall in narrow tongues and fell the whole 100 fathoms so softly it might have been a dream. In that white, the world erased and rewrote itself with every breath. The sea put down thin ice that looked like paper and tore it up again. Men laughed because that is what men ought to do when the world lets them. A woman held her child and looked up at a creature she had never been told to fear and felt the fear anyway, then felt it turn to something larger, and did not name it love because love is too small a word for a thing that saves your life and does not know your name. John stood until the cold put its hands on his bones and asked to come in. And then he went down among his men and his promises and the work that keeps a man from thinking too hard about what waits. If the Night King stood somewhere on the ice and watched him through snow that fell and did not land, if he weighed a spear in a hand that did not tire and thought about the way a dragon's body moved through air, if he smiled, teeth like winter stars, John did not see it. He saw Regal blink slow and content as a cat in a beam of weak sun. He saw Ghost roll onto his back and pretend he had not done it on purpose. He saw Sam with black fingers and a black grin, ink having its way with him. He saw Tormund with a new story to tell and no patience for men who wanted it to be shorter. He saw Ed counting things because counting makes certain men live. He saw the wall, which had stood before him and would, with luck and fire, stand after him. He put his hand on the dragon and the dragon's warmth moved into him, and for a breath, one stolen breath, the cold did not have the last word.